at the hour. Welcome very much to the Japan-Europe Core Group Warsaw meeting 2022 on the future of Russia-China relations and the implications for European and Japanese foreign policy. Welcome very much. My name is Janke Oertler. I'm the director of the Asia program at ECFR, and I would have very much liked to actually have welcomed you from Warsaw. I would have also really have liked to have been able to hand the microphone to Ambassador Miyajima for his welcome remarks, but COVID has obstructed our plans. We are, though, convinced that we can still have an inspiring conversation and a stimulating exchange, despite the fact that we have to do it via the little boxes on the screen in 2D, not in 3D, with no coffee. But at least we get together and can have this conversation on Zoom. We're in the Zoom call. There's also a kind of a broader audience. So for our first session here, that is part of the Japan-Europe Core Group, we are kind of bringing together a gang here in a smaller group on Zoom, but we're also live streaming on YouTube in English and on Facebook in Polish. So welcome to all of those joining us from the outside and from a broader group. We're delighted that the Japanese Embassy in Warsaw has shown such great support to our initiative. And we are very happy to welcome also Ambassador Miyajima here, who will address you in just a few minutes. What we're trying to do with the Japan-Europe Core Group is set the topics on the agenda for the discussions between Eastern European countries and Japan in particular. One of our crucial topics that is of key relevance here is the present and future of the relations between China and Russia. We regard this conversation only as a start. It's not supposed to be a one-off, but the kind of beginning of a building of a network between European and Japanese observers of what is one of the most consequential relationships of our time. Both Russia and China are a challenge to the rules-based international order from which particularly Europe and Japan have benefited greatly in the past. They are a challenge when they work together, but also when they're just working in parallel, following a similar aim on separate paths. There is in Europe still limited expertise on the issue, but we're glad that we've been able to bring together the leading scholars and the brightest minds around a virtual table today. Before I hand over the microphone to Ambassador Miyajima, Ambassador of Japan to Poland, to give him the opportunity to welcome all of you joining us here in the Zoom room and via our live stream from Europe and Asia and maybe across the entire world. We don't know really at this point. And then hand over to Andrew Small, Senior Transatlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, to moderate our kickoff discussion. Please allow me to make a few housekeeping remarks. This first session of the Japan-Europe Core Group is on the record. We have a stellar lineup of speakers, and we will produce a video recording so you can watch the discussion again or share it with interested colleagues after the event. If you're in the Zoom call, we appreciate your questions, and it would be fantastic if you could indicate that you would like to ask a question in the chat. You can also type in your question in the chat. If you want to speak, and if you want to raise your question directly, it is absolutely imperative that you have the camera on. Otherwise, our fantastic viewers on the live stream will just see a black box and will be very irritated. So that is one of the really important items that needs to be done. If you are in the Zoom call, on the bottom, you find a globe that will allow for a simultaneous translation into English or Polish. Just switch it to the right channel that works for your language preference. If you are tuning in via our live stream, you can ask questions by commenting on Facebook in Polish, or you can comment on YouTube in English, depending on the source that you're using, and we will pass those questions on to the moderator. For those of you joining us via Zoom, please log in after this initial discussion via the second link you received for a more detailed off-the-record conversation that will follow. And with this, I would like to thank Ambassador Miyajima again for taking the time and the initiative to enrich our discussions today and join us for this meeting. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Akio Miyajima, and I'm the ambassador here in Warsaw for the last 1 year. But this is my first time to be in this region, so learning little by little. Actually, I was in Japan for 1 month, and then I found that the timeliness and also relevance of this event in Japan, that we are so focusing on the North Korean series of missile launch, including the hypersonic missile launch, but much less about the Ukrainian situation. But ever since I came here, of course, this news really dominates everybody. And today's topic is about Russia, China, future relations in security, economic. It is so relevant for all the experts that on both sides and in each continent, which has quite an expertise to learn each other and end the deepening understanding, because the situation is very, very comprehensive and interconnected. And so I really believe that today's event is very, very relevant. And in these connections, I really like to emphasize that Japan, together with the United States and then like-minded countries, is promoting the idea of the FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific, based on the fundamental values. But this is not just the Indo-Pacific geographically. Last year, that Foreign Minister Motegi visited here in Warsaw, the meeting with the B4 group foreign ministers and also the Baltic states, and then everybody endorsed the idea that that we should maintain the rule-based, international rule-based order. So it has been very, very important to have to promote this idea and then work together for secure that global prosperity and security. Just a couple of things. One is that we know that the history says that Russia invaded Georgia when the opening ceremony of the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympic Games were held, and the Russian invasion of Crimea took place immediately after the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics. And then now that the Beijing Olympics is coming, and Mr. Putin is attending the opening ceremony on the 4th of February, and it is going to be finished on February 20th. So, well, maybe it may not have any relevance, but we have some history. We need to watch very closely that what's happening, not only just in Europe, but maybe some interconnectedness. And last November, Mr. Carl Bildt wrote the Drums of War in Taiwan and Ukraine. I think it is not so likely, but we need to also prepare for such kind of contingencies that even a hypothetical situation. So really, the Europe and then East Asia is connected. And next year, this year, that Germany is the chair of the G7. Next year, Japan is going to be the chair of the G7. And then G20, after the Italy, Indonesia is going to be the chair this year, and then India is going to be the following year. So we really do hope that we could deepen the understanding each other and then strengthen the solidarity among Europe, Japan, and the United States to cope with this situation. And then so really looking forward to have a very, very fruitful, good, insightful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Miedema. And we are looking forward to an insightful discussion. I think that is the right kind of start for handing it over to Andrew Small, who will be moderating our first panel. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Janka, and thanks very much for the chance to moderate this session today with really some of the best experts on this topic. We have our four speakers who will kick us off. Sasha Gabuyev, Senior Fellow and Chair of the Russia and the Asia Pacific Program at Carnegie Moscow, Professor and former Ambassador Bogdan Goralczyk from the Center for Europe at the University of Warsaw, Yuichi Hosoya, Professor of International Politics at Keio University, and Kadri Leek, Senior Policy Fellow at ECFR. I would also, since this hasn't already come up, strongly encourage people to read Kadri's new report, which fed into the event today. I think really one of the most subtle and interesting papers on the China-Russia relationship that I've read in a long time. We will come back to some of these kind of wider questions on the long arc of the Russia-China relationship, but jumping off really from the ambassador's opening comments on this. we are clearly in a crisis context at the moment. And if we go back as well to 2014, which had such a profound impact on the Russia-China relationship too, it really seems like it may be worth kicking off some of the discussions by looking at the dynamics around the current situation as well, and how they might play into the China-Russia relationship in future, and how the China-Russia relationship itself may condition what we're likely to see unfolding in literally the weeks and months ahead. So the questions that I would like to kick off with to the panel, who will not be making kind of sweeping opening remarks, will be kind of just jumping off from some of the questions that I will start off with. First of all, I'd like to kind of start a bit more on the Moscow end and then come back to the Beijing end on this. So somewhat as Janka was presenting in her opening comments, one of the hypotheses about the China-Russia relationship was that they were increasingly able to provide a kind of mutually enabling backdrop for respective actions that they wanted to take in Asia and Europe, even in circumstances where the two sides were not actively cooperating. I'd like to ask the panel to address what Russia is looking for from China as this plays out, as the current situation plays out. What sort of exchanges are we seeing between Moscow and Beijing that we perhaps wouldn't have seen in the past, going back to 2008 or 2014? There certainly were not those exchanges in 2008, as we know. Is China understood by Russia to be providing implicit or practical support? Have the economic and financial calculations between the two sides in the years since Crimea affected Russia's calculations on sanctions? I'd like a couple of our speakers to try and unpack this a bit for us. And I'm going to go to Sasha first for some comments before coming to Kadri. Sasha, go ahead.
Thanks, Andrew, and always pleasure to be a guest of ECFR. Too bad we cannot do that in person, but c'est la vie. I think that on your broader point, I don't think that there is any coordination on the actions around Ukraine or around Taiwan between Moscow and Beijing, at least at this stage. We don't have any indications or data to support that theory. I don't think that Russia needs any Chinese material support to do what it wants to do around Ukraine. We still don't know, but I think that the omens are pointing to a very dangerous and dark moment in history. Same, I don't think that China needs Russian direct support, except for advanced weapons and joint development projects that are done in the military domain. But overall, I think that the current state of the relationship and the hopes that Russia puts on cooperation on China are presiding on some overarching trends. There is this economic complementarity that's there and has been more widely explored since 2014. There are multiple projects that are coming on stream and in full capacity, like the Power of Siberia gas pipeline agreed in 2014. The export from the Russian LNG is expanding from Yamal, and China is a big participant in Arctic LNG too, where Japan is also a participant. So there are multiple projects that have been launched in the previous decade that are now contributing to trade volume and are allowing Russia to diversify and reduce its economic dependency on Europe and arrive at a more balanced trade structure. We've seen the Chinese custom figures that the trade volume last year has been 146 billion US. That's a jump of around 38%. It's a huge increase, which is explained both by growth in commodity prices, particularly in the last quarter, but also in increased volumes of gas flowing through Power of Siberia, LNG coming from Yamal, and coal coming from the ports of the Far East. This is very likely to continue to increase. So China's share of Russia's trade was just 10% in 2013. It was roughly 20% in the year of 2020. We'll see what the actual share will be this year, but this rebalancing is ongoing. It's a slow process. You cannot kind of reduce your dependence on Europe overnight, but definitely an exposure to China and new sources of revenues are helping Russia a lot. I think that the coming visit might be of similar significance like Putin's trip to Shanghai in May 2014 after the first sectoral sanctions. There are a lot of agreements in the bilateral pipeline that have been agreed upon, inked, but not signed in the presence of the leaders. So probably we'll see an endless list of agreements to be signed on February 4. As we know, many of those agreements will stay as MOU without implementation, but many will contribute to the further strengthening of economic link between the two. I think that many people in the market expect signing of Power of Siberia 2. We'll see whether that happens or not. But there are multiple contracts that will just increase the trade flow. Very final point here. I do think that Russia's more secure position or more confident position with regard to potential sanctions that the West is to impose if Russia is to violate further Ukraine territorial integrity and sovereignty are mostly explained by the careful and smart actions of the Russian government itself domestically. So the adjustment of the currency and the ruble setting price for the ruble mechanism, the more disciplined fiscal policy, introduction of the budgetary rule for oil revenues, that oil contributed to the surplus and record high gold and currency reserves that we are seeing on the balance sheet of the Russian central bank. So this is all mostly the domestic works of the smartest part of the Russian bureaucracy. It's not because of China. But I think when it comes of China, the importance is the alternative revenue stream that will be immune from the sanctions, help in connecting to the Chinese financial system via interlinks between the Russian analogy of SWIFT and the Chinese analogy of SWIFT, more exposure to RMB on the balance sheet of the banks, and also ability to clear some transactions in RMB rather than in dollars and euro, that so far has been the currency of preference. And finally, and this is part which is, I think, more obscure, if the sanctions go after semiconductor industry and after the pipeline and are in the Menendez bill, Russia hopes that China will be of help, but I don't think that we have details on the direct interactions between the two governments. But definitely the big hope is that China will be one of the supporting elements for Russia to withstand the pain that the West is ready to impose. I stop here.
Thanks very much, Sasha. Kadri, I'd be keen to get your comments on that as well. I mean, do you agree essentially no coordination at all, but this kind of, again, almost enabling economic backdrop, which really, as Sasha laid it out, seems kind of quite expansive in a certain sense, and something that, again, if we were to go back to 2014, was not present on that sort of scale. Any thoughts you have?
Yeah. Yes, hello from me. I agree absolutely with what Sasha said. I don't think there is any joint planning behind what we are seeing in Ukraine. Getting control of Ukraine is President Putin's quite personal obsession, as seems to me. I sometimes wonder to what extent even Russian wider political elite shares it, but no one, of course, is going to challenge him on that. As concerns China, my impression is that the Kremlin expects China to be understanding of its aims, but not actively supporting. And understanding exactly because one thing that unites Russia and China is the protest against Western-led rule-based international order with its universal ambitions. That is something that Russia has struggled for 30 years. First, it tried to fit in, find a role. When it started challenging it, first implicitly, later explicitly, and now it's all in the open. And likewise, China, though different way, but China also try to fit into the order economically, at least, not as regards maybe human rights standards. And now they are disputing it ever more loudly. So I think that is something that unites the two, not joint ideology in the positive sense, not something that they are pursuing actively, but rejection of the ideologized approach as such, and the American one in particular. And I think that understanding would be there for Moscow, and Alex is completely right. I also think that economically Moscow can afford to do bad things in Ukraine because it has managed to sanction-proof itself. And yet again, as Alex said, it's largely Moscow's doing. They have taken care of their domestic vulnerabilities, but of course, the trade context helps. I mean, China is a big customer for Russian raw materials exports. Also, Europe might need Russia more than Russia needs Europe at this particular moment. It hasn't been so always, it will not be so, but right at the moment it is. So it could be that the West doesn't have much economic leverage over Russia. All that said, I think actually China's presence plays into some political leverage there might be, because if by invading Ukraine, Russia tears up its full Western relationship, I think it would still be so much more dependent on China politically as well as economically, if not immediately, but in perspective. But I wonder if that is something that Moscow likes. My impression is that Moscow enjoys its current position, its ability to be in talking terms with the United States as well, because that allows it to play a bigger role in between the two, to be a sort of balancer and really benefit from both relationships with China, with the US, to take the most of both. If it upends its US relationship, I think China gains upper hand in the Russia-China relationship. And that makes me wonder whether Moscow really will go for all-out invasion in Ukraine. Rather, I would suggest, I don't exclude military action, but I think that would be more limited and something that would boost Russia's talking position vis-a-vis the West, as opposed to finishing all talk for the foreseeable future.
Thanks, Kadri. Very, very briefly, just on the dynamics with the US on this, is there a view in Moscow that a heightened US focus on China creates the possibility, the opportunity for a different settlement with Washington on Europe? Is this weighing at all? I've seen some commentary on the Russian side that suggests that. I'd just be interested in any thoughts you have on that question when we're talking about reverse Kissingers and all.
Yes, well, if you ask me, I think that is partially the case. I think US departure from Afghanistan could have encouraged Moscow to do what it does, and not because that makes US look weak in Moscow's eyes. That was the take of Russian official propaganda. People who know better had sort of opposite view. They said that, you see, Biden is picking his fights. He is giving up on impossible mission to be the world's policeman. That makes America stronger, that they are not trying to fight on all fronts, but they are being selective. And I think, yeah, the fact of Biden picking his fights may have encouraged the Kremlin to assume that, okay, maybe he wants to also stabilize relationship with Moscow around parameters that are different from what have been possible in the past, in order to be able to focus on China. So I would suggest that, yes, it does play some role in Kremlin's thinking.
I'm going to come to the other two speakers now. Bogdan, I saw you nodding along to this. I just wondered if you might then perhaps speak to this angle as well, but also begin, before I move to Yuichi as well, to also start talking a little bit about how this is seen on the Chinese side. I mean, is this understood to present opportunities for Beijing in relation to Moscow, and in a certain sense in the additional breathing space that it affords them while Russia is and this crisis is taking up so much bandwidth now for Western policymakers? Or are you seeing concerns on the Chinese side too? Be good to get your comments.
Thank you, Andrew the Great, if I may say so, for allowing me to speak and allowing me to speak about geostrategy and geopolitics, because to my mind, this is the most serious issue right now. We are in the state in flux on the global scene. Everything is on the move, including China, including Russia, including Ukraine, and the global order. And in this respect, I would say we have the title of our discussion today, China-Russia, Strategic Alignment or Alliance in the Making, with the question mark. I have no question marks in front of me. I would say what we have right now between Beijing and Moscow is nothing else than alliance of convenience. Once it was called marriage of convenience. This is an alliance of convenience, because in both states we have authoritarian regimes, very strict ones, which are dissatisfied from the current global order, value-based order, leading by the Americans. And in this respect of China, during the pandemic, we are closed in our houses, in our homes, while the world is trembling. Please do remember that prior to the pandemic, we had already a trade war initiated and instigated by the Trump administration. And during the pandemic, another 2 wars were added to the spectrum and to the agenda, namely ideological war and probably axiological one. And first of all, high technology. That's the reason we are talking so much about Huawei, 5G, or TikTok. I do agree with Alexander Gabuyev that economic dimension is a very crucial one, but I will divide my intervention into 2 sections. I think that we have short-term debate and long-term strategy in relationship between Russia and China, or China and Russia. In short term, they have the same assessment of the current situation, that the Western world is weakened, that it is divided, polarized, needs a healing. If you remember the first State of the Union of Joe Biden, so you will understand that it was half of his intervention, half an hour he was talking about the necessity of healing of the situation inside of the US. The situation in the European Union is constant crisis management. So both leaders, Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi Jinping, realized this is the window of opportunity. And about Putin, already my predecessors mentioned some words. However, I would add the Chinese dimension. When Mr. Xi Jinping was declaring a few years ago what is the content of Chinese dream, 中国梦, he was talking about 14 aims and goals in front of him. When he was speaking just three weeks ago in his New Year's speech for this year, he was naming only one item, Taiwan. So we are guessing, we have no opportunity to discuss about the facts because both regimes are not transparent. However, I guess all my knowledge says that during the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games in Beijing, there will be a huge debate between the leaders, because on the one side, you have the Ukraine, and Mr. Putin would like to have more than Crimea, more than Donbass, while Mr. Xi Jinping already swallowed Hong Kong during the pandemic, and he would like to swallow Taiwan, and we have a problem. Because from his perspective, which is strongly supported by the Chinese audience, Taiwan is internal issue of China, while the Americans already during the Korean War declared that this is territory which is a flagship for American security in Western Pacific. So we have short-term linkages which are bringing them together very strongly. But on the long term, I don't know how many of you are speaking Chinese and are familiar with the Chengyu, which is a kind of a proverb expression in Chinese. There's one Chengyu called Tong Chuang Yimeng. They are sleeping in the same bed, but have different dreams. And this is actually the best description of Russian-Chinese relationship. As you see, I'm sitting in my home, so I'm supported by the whole library behind me. And before getting started, I am dealing with China more than 4 decades. So I have a very long Chinese memory. And I brought this book, published in March 1978, which is untitled Russian Invasion on Chinese Territories. And you have the map there. I don't know how it is how it will be visible in here, probably a little bit, but you have Baikal Lake on the one side and Vladivostok on the other side, and you have a borderline dividing the whole territory. Part of it belongs to China. Of course, it is hidden. Nobody talks about this, but sooner or later, somebody could come out with this because it was expressed. And it is definitely not only in my library, as you can guess. So we have in the long term a problem. Number one, for how long Russian Federation would like to stay a raw materials provider for quickly developing and modernizing itself, China. Raw materials meaning energy sources, timber from the Siberia, but also young girls, like it or not. Sorry for calling the girls as the raw material. I know how it ugly sounds. However, the Chinese have the problem, young Chinese, 16 out of 100 of them have no chance to marry because there's problem of the result of one-child policy. So we have many problems to be resolved in the longer distance. And finally, to bring back the current situation, for both of them, the problem is of Kazakhstan, and I guess we will deal with that in the next round, but one is extremely important, and this will be final statement from my side in this intervention. Probably this week, the name of Brzezinski will be popular again here in Warsaw because the son of Zbigniew Brzezinski is coming as a US ambassador. January 20 is approaching. Biden administration is 1 year old, so time to send the first ambassador to Poland, named Brzezinski. However, the older one, Zbigniew Brzezinski, wrote, as you probably remember, some of you, in late 1990s, in the topic of unipolar moment, he wrote a book, A Grand Chessboard. And in this book, Grand Chessboard, a strategy handbook, he described the bad dream of American strategists. You know what was the bad dream described in that book? Then Russia and China and Iran are strongly cooperating. And that's what has happened. when the Americans left ISAF and Afghanistan last year. We have a new situation. So this is something which is also necessary to be described. And absolutely the final one, another book, because I'm in the bookstore right now, former chief of diplomacy of India, Shiv Shankar Menon, who was also previously ambassador of India to China, and he has started his career, diplomatic career in China, has published last year this absolutely outstanding, I advise to all the audience to read it. It was published last year, India and Asian Geopolitics. And in that, as a former chief of diplomacy of India, he is saying that China, supported by Russia, are already ruling on the something which is described as Euro-Asian territories. So they are the leaders and the West is absent. So we have many problems and many open issues in front of us, and many guessing and many necessities to further discuss. Janka, you need to come to Warsaw, organize us again and again and again, especially that you have so Polish name that nobody will care that you are not Polish. So this is the final statement of mine during this first intervention. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And thanks for putting so many other issues on the table as well that I think we'll come back to. I cannot help, of course, but highlight another paper, which is Sasha's paper on Kazakhstan, which I read the English version. I see there is now an updated version in Russian because it was produced in such kind of live circumstances that I think rebalances some of it. But it was an excellent piece that I'm sure most of the people on the call have read. I want to go to Yuichi now, though, to do two things. One is, again, I wonder if you might talk a little bit further on how this is being seen, the current context and crisis on the Chinese side, but then also expanding on the ambassador's remarks at the beginning. I'd be very keen to also hear how you think these developments are being perceived in Tokyo. I know you're not sitting in Tokyo right now, of course, but I mean we've heard from plenty of strategists in Japan at different points over the last few years that we should be careful not to push the sides too closely together, and also really trying to work to ensure that Europe focuses on what is arguably the bigger long-term challenge emanating from China. How does what we're seeing now play into that analysis and those efforts on the Japanese side? The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Andrew, for giving us a great questions. Too many great questions, perhaps, but I'm glad to have these, and I'm also grateful for Janka and ECFR for organizing such a great debate and a great opportunity to discuss on important questions. I'm now currently sitting in Cambridge and far away from Tokyo as a visiting scholar, but I spent a month in Tokyo and meeting with some of the Diet members and senior officials within the government to discuss on the current international issues. I think that the topic today is extremely relevant, not just because this is important and pressing issues, but also we have to cover all the important actors, of course, Russia, China, Europe, Japan, but we miss one superpower, of course, the United States. We all need to be aware of the foreign policy of the United States, and of course, the United States is now creating a new national security strategy. So Japanese foreign policy will be heavily affected by the direction of the current Biden administration. Of course, the current Biden administration foreign policy is also be affected by the result of the midterm elections soon this year. So we have so many unknowns, but so far at the same time, we have to understand the movement of the four powers, of course, Russia, China, Europe, and Japan. It's quite ambitious. Today's topic is quite ambitious and global as well, but because we are linking each bilateral relations by covering the great global geostrategic relations. But putting aside these kind of initial remarks, I also like to focus on the Japan's reaction to the current move. In the last decade, I think that particularly Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, was trying to create much closer Russo-Japanese relations. In 2014, Prime Minister Abe visited Russia for attending Sochi Winter Olympic Games to meet with President Putin, of course, against some of the criticism coming from Western countries. I think that the basic motivation of Prime Minister Abe was trying to create a better Russo-Japanese relation because he might have thought that it would be possible to wedge the close relationship between Russia and China, because it was sometimes seen as a marriage of convenience, of a partnership or alliance of convenience, as is mentioned before. But after seeing the Russo-China relations in the last decade, I now have an impression that the Russo-Chinese relation is much stronger than we thought. There are several reasons for this. First of all, I think that in Western countries, particularly in the United States, we have had a kind of triumphalism of liberal democracy. We thought that liberal democracy would prevail automatically, but of course it was not at all automatic process. And of course, we see much more pluralist international society than solidarist international society. Each country has its own civilization and history. That's why it now is clearer than before that it is extremely difficult for us to spread liberal democracy, both in China and Russia, in different ways. So this is one thing. We have had a kind of a triumphalism. On the other hand, at the same time, particularly in the United States, there exists a kind of a sense of decline of both democracy, decline of the United States at the same time, even though the United States remain the strongest power and will remain, I think, the strongest power in coming decades. But in the United States, for some reasons, I think they have had a kind of a sense of retreat, a sense of decline, mainly because of the rapid rise of China. Rapid rise of Chinese military power, Chinese economy, Chinese technology as well. And in Japan, we have similar kind of sense of threat or sense of decline. And so to confront with the rapid decline of particularly Chinese military activities, I think that we now have much closer ties among liberal democracy to defend liberal democratic ideals, to defend rule-based international society, and to defend our international status or international power, of course, European power, American power, Japanese power. So in this way, I think that now we are in Japan abandoning to try to wedge between Russia and China because the tie is stronger. But on the other hand, they have different national interests. So far, one of the biggest reasons why they are closer might be they are much more isolated than before. A decade before, of course, we thought that China could become a responsible stakeholder. And of course, China was quite successful in organizing Beijing Summer Olympic Games 12 years before, and 14 years before. And as well, Russia was within the G8 summit still a decade before. So in that sense, I think that both Russia and China are now become much more isolated than before. So this drives them, both Russia and China, to be closer. So in this way, on the one hand, we need to defend our liberal democracy. We have to strengthen our liberal democracies. We have been weakening our liberal democracy by ourselves. So we need to create a stronger liberal democracy. Then we can have much stronger sense of our system, political system, economic system, and so on. This is one thing. And the other thing is that still, I think that we will see the continuation of a strong tie between the two sides because they, as long as they feel that they are isolated, in this way, I think that Japan is changing its foreign policy from the previous standpoint. Previously, as I explained, particularly Prime Minister Abe tried to wedge between the two powers, Russia and China. And nowadays, we are becoming much more confident in trying to create stronger liberal democracy or stronger rule-based international system. I stop here.
Thanks very much. I have one more round that I want to do with the panel on. I sort of subverted the question list that the organizers have, but I'd like to come back to that. But if the people in the room can, virtual room can start thinking about their questions, and anyone on the live stream, if you didn't catch it at the beginning, whatever questions you post there will be conveyed to me that I can pose to the panel as well. But I kind of did want to zoom back out briefly to look at the broader relationship, but before we go into the wider discussion. We have clearly moved forward in the analysis kind of 100 miles from the days where people were just analyzing this relationship in terms of the limitations and differences and why all sorts of things weren't possible, as we've seen in recent years on all sorts of different fronts. So I'd kind of like the panelists to answer briefly what they see now as the cutting edge of the relationship. What forms of cooperation between the two sides might you envisage in the years ahead that would have seemed impossible even a few years back in your kind of further imaginings on the Russia-China relationship? But then the flip side of that as well, one of the things I took from Kadri's paper was more of a kind of cautionary note again about Chinese assertiveness, Russian grievances, whether Russia should be quietly hedging. I think particularly jumping off from the article by Lukin and Denisov. Are we running into some new limitations again, or even reversals in the relationship? Is that something we should be thinking about differently? I come back to Sasha for comments on both of those dimensions.
Very quickly, on the peak, the trade has now surpassing new milestones and will continue to do so for the reasons that we've discussed. I think that when Alexander and Igor have written their piece, Putin didn't say that we actually do develop jointly new weapon systems, but because of CATSA, it's all wrapped in such layers of secrecy that not even people like Vasily Kashin really want to go in that direction and produce public pieces on that because of the changed environment. Definitely not myself or any Carnegie scholars want to go and investigate and talk to sources in order to bring more kind of food for thought and fact to the global blob and even our donors at Carnegie. So not this part. But we know that there is a lot of stuff happening, and that stuff is consequential. Just check your notes with all of the Pentagon officials and people in the Western intel community who might see some signs that we don't see in the public domain. So I think that this is consequential. This is something that I didn't think would happen if you asked me 2 years ago. I would say, sales of new weapons is possible because it's a window of opportunity in the Chinese markets. But joint development, just look at the civilian programs like wide-body aircraft. They have a helicopter, it's lagging behind. It's just the level of mistrust. The Chinese are very assertive and they want to exploit their kind of new leverage. It's still progressing. Even in the civilian domains, there have been progress on, they have a helicopter, there have been progress on the wide-body aircraft. And yes, it's happening more on the Chinese terms. But I think that the Russians are pragmatic that this is the best bet that they can get. And that's the reality about Russia-Chinese relationship. I think that we all share the assessment. It's brilliantly pointed out in Kadri's piece. I think that that's my kind of punchline over the course of the recent years, and I'm getting bored myself, but that's the fact. The asymmetry is there, and the deal that you can cut with China today is better than the deal you can cut tomorrow if you are Russia. And the deal that you can cut tomorrow is better than the deal you can cut in 2 or 3 days. because the asymmetry and the leverage that China is gaining is there. So when it comes to natural gas pipelines, weapons transfers, I think that many people here understand that the sooner you rush there, the better the outcomes. It doesn't all work mechanically, but I think that we will see a lot of progress along different lines. Final point, yes, the progress of Chinese kind of exposure to Chinese market from 10% to 20% happened over 7 years. That's a lot. But then it's just 20%. And it's a way to go to the level of dependency on European Union where Russia has been in 2014. And then if you talk to people in town, they will tell you back in 2014, we have been so dependent on the West in terms of trade, in terms of capital markets, technology. Our elite was spending a lot of time there. And when the West came to check our red lines on Ukraine, we were able to stand up and punch them in the face. So we don't have these irritants like human rights. Why would Chinese care about the fate of Alexei Navalny, or whether we use chemical weapon to poison people we don't like on European soil? So this basket of thorny issues doesn't exist between Chinese and us. So it's much more predictable. But even then, if they try to use the leverage 10, 15, 20 years down the road, which is kind of eternity, we don't know whether people who are making decisions in the Kremlin now will be still around, will still be able to get up. And so this is the short-termist view, which is there in Moscow, that actually benefits and fuels the rapid development of this relationship. I'll stop here.
The downside risks. I am curious to get your comments on that.
Okay, so here are the downside risks. I don't think that the current government will deal with them 5-10 years down the road. And I think, again, if we look at the history of the project that have been materialized since 2014, I think China was pretty careful in making them really win-win, in not squeezing Russia too hard on the gas price or other elements of the relationship. And people who are around Putin, like Timchenko, get the sweetest deals possible given the conditions on Sinopec buying into Sibur or financing terms for Yabal LNG. It turns out that the loan terms that Chinese policy banks have provided were better than the terms provided by Russian banks like Sberbank and Gazprom Bank. So I think that this is all very carefully done. And here, like 5, maybe 10 years down the road, the benefits are here. The problems will start towards the end of this decade and later, when probably Putin and Xi are out of the picture and their personal relationship is an important element of the relationship overall. China most likely gets more powerful, even more assertive. And then the public opinion does play a role in China's foreign policy making. I don't believe that Wolf Order diplomacy is just a product of Chinese diplomats tuning in to the boss's line. I think that it's a broader strain that Ambassador Gazalchik pointed to. It's not necessarily that the Chinese will demand Baikal or Vladivostok back, but that issue will pop up in public debate. And I don't think that the Chinese government will be able to kind of clamp it down, or will be willing to clamp it down, because they will always have the ability to point out to those public sentiments and say, oh, Russia, like, you need to do some favors to us. And for example, how about your arms trade with India, right? You need to stop it because India is not friend of China. And by the way, our trade is 200 billion, your trade with India is 30 billion US, you need to choose. So I think there are some limitations on Russia's ability to act as an independent global power in the Asia Pacific. There are some downside risks. The other are commercial terms of sales. If you're tying up yourself, your resources to the one market where China is the only buyer of commodities, and that's increasingly a buyer's market because of energy transition, not now, but 10 years down the road, you are in a weaker position and you're giving your partner bigger leverage. But unfortunately, it's inevitable. It's not that Russia has a lot of technological expertise or resources to build more LNG plants that will give diversity to Russian exports. And then the people who are closest to Mr. Putin are in the building pipelines business. They are not in the building LNG plants business, unfortunately. So that's another factor here.
Thanks, Sasha. Kadri, if you might comment as well, both on the kind of the bleeding edge question on the relationship, what you're hearing perhaps in your exchanges on some of the things that aren't being made public by certain officials at the moment, but that people are kind of watching with concern. But then also whether you do share this analysis. There's your paper kind of looks at the post-Putin scenarios as well, as Sasha was just commenting, but you did kind of highlight some of the existing short-term irritants as well, and kind of I wondered if you might say a couple of words on that. If you can unmute, sorry.
Sorry, yes, one should know by now about unmuting, but you always forget. Yes, I agree with Sasha that the relationship is definitely reaching heights that I also didn't think possible. I mean, the joint military drills, training interoperability, the way they are doing, that's certainly something that also I didn't consider possible some time ago. So there we are, but I do have some doubts about longer term dynamic. Yeah, as my paper highlights, I must confess that my paper was partly inspired by Emmanuel Macron and his desire to talk with Russia so as not to be caught between China and the US and to sort of tear Russia off China. I thought that no, that's not possible. That's incredibly naive. How can he even think so? And I had to change my mind a little bit while doing my research. I saw that there are trends that actually create some space for Europe to, or for the West to have influence on the relationship, not in the sort of quick manner. I mean, no Kissinger style U-turn. I don't think that is feasible. But what is possible is to give Russia some space to hedge against China. And it could be that Russia will want to make use of that space. It's not for granted. I mean, there are trends going in different directions and it can go either way, but it's not totally impossible. And I see the relationship really as sort of very dynamic and amalgam of different trends. There definitely is a fundamental security need. I mean, Russia really has existential need to maintain somewhat cordial relationship with China because China is a huge power right next to the border. There are no buffer states between Russia and China. And that is really important for Moscow. I don't think that's something that the West realizes clearly enough. That said, there are other trends that could go either way. I mean, trade, for instance, yeah, it is peaking for now, and it could keep going up for some time more. But what then? I mean, many China experts in Moscow tell me that China actually intends to get self-reliant, so that in 10 years' time, they will need a lot less from Russia, even in terms of energy exports, because they just don't want to be dependent on others. And that immediately has implications, of course, on Russia's trade balance. It's also interesting to see how the relationship is managed in Russia. It really is very, very top-down. The Kremlin has given everyone the orders to view China as a friend. So everyone is doing that. That results sometimes in lots of opportunistic use of China. You know, for academics, it's easy to sell their projects when they sell it that's related to China, developing links to China. But actually, it is still somewhat hollow. And I'm not a China expert. My focus is on Russian foreign policy. And in that context, you know, the more I learned about Russia-China, it brought to my mind a really good article Andrei Kortunov has written about Russia's relationship with the European Union. And he wrote it, I think, in 2016. And he said that, yeah, it was prioritized, but in a top-down manner, and that meant that it was actually hollow. Moscow had no understanding of different undercurrents in the EU. They failed to cultivate horizontal links. It was sort of over-focused on summitry, declarations, institutions. It lacked actual substance. And I wonder sometimes whether something similar is not happening in Russia-China relationship. Alex in Moscow Carnegie conducted a really good questionnaire with Russian-China experts asking about the relationships and the state's input. Sadly, you haven't translated it into English. I think it had some wonderful insights. People saying that it's primitive relationships. It's focused on political declarations and export of commodities. That's not very sophisticated. And Russia doesn't invest in quality of a relationship. If that stays so, then I wonder what's becoming of it. And likewise, yeah, Chinese assertiveness. I wonder about the dynamic of that. It seems to me that risk could go up, whereas sort of ideological stance by Western powers, sort of emphasis on universalism of Western rules and norms, for good or bad, I think that is going to decline a little bit, as we already see in Biden's policy. And I think the EU has to review its stance as well, given that EU's rules and norms are not so easily expanding any longer. We need to find alternative foreign policy tools. So I wonder if, it would be interesting to reconvene 10 years from now and actually review some of these issues and see where we are, what's come of these trends, which way they are going. As for now, I think they can go either way. So yes.
Thanks very much, Kadri. I wanted actually to go to Yuichi on this next. Actually going back also to the ambassador's comments at the beginning about Taiwan, and just what are you, I think various of us have sat in meetings with US officials and others saying, not we think this will happen, but you need to at least think through these scenarios seriously, which is clearly not something we've been doing. I'm just kind of wondering if you might speak to, again, looking at the kind of further edge of the possible in the relationship, what you might be worried about, particularly in the strategic context in East Asia and the wider Indo-Pacific region as well.
Well, thank you very much. About Taiwan, I think that the Japan's experts agree that it is quite unlikely that China would soon invade directly the main island of Taiwan. But on the other hand, it is quite likely that China would do in other ways, like conducting some cyber attacks to Taiwan, or overtaking some of the smaller uninhabited islands on the periphery of Taiwan, or trying to infiltrate into Taiwan's politics from outside. So there are many ways that China can do to transform Taiwan's foreign policy. And of course, it is quite clear that the current Beijing government dislike Taiwan's tilt towards the West or tilt towards the United States. On the other hand, of course, European countries like Lithuania or UK as well, these countries are much more hostile to China than before. So in the sense, I think that China is isolated, but the real problem is that the China or Chinese politics really doesn't care about international public opinion much less than before. So it means that regardless of the criticism from our side, if China decides, of course, China do it. So this is a serious problem. That's why Japanese government is strengthening the US-Japan alliance, and the Japanese government also enhancing its security partnership with the UK, France, Australia, India and some other countries as well. So by creating much stronger deterrence, it is likely that China think that the time is not now. Maybe Chinese government is trying to prolong the time. So I think that it works. It means that by enhancing deterrence, I think that because Chinese government clearly understand power politics. If China is weaker, I don't think that China is easily engaged some of the conduct to invade or transform Taiwan. So this is my take.
Thanks, Yuichi. Bogdan, I'll give you kind of the last word on this bit of the cycle before we go to other comments and questions from the group.
Thank you very much. If I may, I would like to react for the previous intervention of Yuichi when he was so strongly pronounced necessity of cooperation within the framework of value-based order. Please do remember that I'm talking from Warsaw, and by coincidence, Piotr Buras, for instance, can confirm that when dealing all my lifetime with China, I am absolutely fluent in Hungarian language. So Orban regime is also my priority. From this perspective, just yesterday, we have an announcement here in Warsaw that Polish President Duda is flying for the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games. So what kind of alliance arranged by the US it is? This is an open question, and we have a lot of troubles and problems in front of us. We have a new coalition in Germany, and we have shuttle diplomacy right now. Antony Blinken and German foreign minister are flying and discussing debates very crucial for the future of Europe. And not only German elections, but especially the upcoming French elections are absolutely crucial for the future of European integration. But this is for another debate. I am just opening your minds and eyes that the situation is more dynamic and more, let's say, in flex. Turning towards the crucial question, and you just raised in this round, to my mind, we have a situation like this. Since the Treaty of Nerchinsk, 1689, until the dissolvement of the Soviet Union, so until the early 1990s, we had the same situation. Russia or Soviet Union was the big brother to China. Now we have situation vice versa. And the huge geostrategic question for Russian elites especially is for how long Russia wants to be a minor partner in this relationship, smaller brother, and raw materials provider. To my mind, point number two, nothing will happen during the President Putin leadership, and he will be ruling forever, as we know, by definition. However, during the Putin's term, to my mind, relationship between Russia and China will be strong. As Alexander Sasha Gabuyev has mentioned, growing in economic sense. It will be, I am just calling it a kind of alliance, but officially it is comprehensive strategic dialogue, the same status as Poland or Hungary has. However, we have some linkages, liaisons, strong points linking them together. Point number one, to my understanding, the most crucial one, that during the Trump administration, Americans changed their status and their position towards China. Instead of engagement of more than 4 decades since Kissinger and Nixon, we have strategic competition, which was evaluated for the first time in military and security papers in late 2017, early 2018. So Americans changed the attitude, and Trump factor changed the philosophy of current relationship on the global scene. Instead of values, we have bilateral deals. Instead of norms and values, we have interests. We have power politics again. And in this respect, please observe what has happened during the Biden administration. On the one hand, they organized the Summit of Democracies, but on the other hand, towards China, towards Russia, they're trying to continue the power politics Trump inaugurated. But here is a change. Initially, China and Russia were stipulated as the two main enemies and threats and challenges. However, recently, if you observe item by item, issue by issue of Foreign Affairs magazine, you will see that there's a huge debate in the US about so-called strategic ambiguity, that America has no clear-cut strategy towards China, while towards Russia is getting more and more flexible. For instance, in Antony Blinken's speech on policy towards China, he was saying China is the only country with the economic, diplomatic, military, and technology power to be a security challenge toward the US. So Russia is already excluded from that. Maybe during this current debates and shuttle diplomacy we are observing right now, maybe something will change, but we need to be careful and cautious because something is undergoing. It is not time for Kissinger's turn for change of the alliances, but in the longer term, everything is possible. Why it is not time to change the alliances right now? Because we have, as a linking point, very strong personal relationship between Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi Jinping. Please do remember that the first visit of Mr. Xi Jinping as the president of China was to Russia in early 2013. And they met in different gatherings more than 20 times. So they are trusting each other, and they have the same, let's say, vision of the future of relationship on the bilateral one and of the global order. They are satisfied that they have similar authoritarian rules. However, the whole relationship, Alexander Sasha Gabuyev is right, is deeply asymmetric. China is growing faster, China is getting stronger, and the question is what will be after Mr. Putin, after Mr. Xi Jinping in 10 years' time. So here we have a lot of open questions on the global scene. And finally, as we know, and nobody mentioned that, China initiated two strategies towards Europe. One is 16+1, the other one, Belt and Road Initiative. And what will be the future of Russian-Chinese cooperation under them, especially Belt and Road Initiative, because what has happened in Kazakhstan recently was definitely a troublemaker in this relationship. If you open another circle of discussion, I can stop here now. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And once again, you've put all the other issues on the table that we have not been able to dig into in depth yet. But we have about half an hour for questions, comments, which I hope we can do. And immediately I see Margareta Klein, go ahead. And actually before that, just remind anyone who's speaking to keep your cameras on for the live stream. Even if you have a sock puppet of yourself instead of your face, just make sure the camera is on, because otherwise we will have a black screen. Margareta.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that great initiative. It's really good to be here, and thanks for inviting me. So I just want to raise one topic which strikes me at the previous weeks. That is that Russia is really promoting the narrative that Russia and China could somehow forge an alliance. Putin made that point at Valdai 2020 when he spoke about the possibility of creating an alliance, and Peskov spoke in December about Russia and China as being allies. So I don't see any point in really Russia and China becoming allies because of divergent interests, because of divergent interests and conflicts with regard to Central Asia, for example. But for me, there is a great incentive for Russia to advocate and to promote that narrative in order to force Western countries to come with concessions to Russia with regard to the European security order. And there is a risk by the side of the Western public opinion and media to put up that narrative and enhance it. But the real questions and threats when it comes to Russian-Chinese military and security cooperation, in my mind, are not so much about forging a formal or informal alliance. It's about enhancing the modernization of the PLA in China by Russia, weapons equipment, and that is about authoritarian learning when it comes to hybrid threats. And that is what I see as the main obstacle towards Germany and towards Poland and towards the European Union. It's about learning with regard to disinformation campaigns. It's learning cyber repression for opposition forces and testing the unity of the European Union and NATO. And therefore, in my guess, Russia is quite carefully watching what China is doing with regard to Lithuania at the moment, for example, and learning from how to undermine the unity and solidarity. And that is, for me, the most important threat when it comes to Russian-Chinese military and security cooperation. Just want to make that brief comment. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll give the panel chances to comment on this as well, and perhaps also on this question that we didn't spend so much time on the kind of the joint ideology or otherwise question. But go now to Lukasz for his comment or question.
Yeah, thank you very much, and many thanks for the excellent discussion so far. A comment and a question. A comment is just, I've been watching these discussions about Russia-China relationship for a while, and I'm always struck by this kind of majority opinion that things may be going well right now, but sooner or later the relationship would go sour, that there is something wrong inherently in this relationship, and 5 years from now, 10 years from now, it will go wrong. And I'm worried that there's kind of a certain bias there, that we are underestimating the political class, the bureaucracies, the business communities, but also the quality of the leadership in both countries, because so far they have very skillfully managed to avoid some of the dangers and potential breaking points that were identified by experts 10 years from now, 5 years from now. And they very skillfully managed to expand this relationship. So I'm throwing just this at experts. Aren't you underestimating the skillfulness and the ability to adapt by both countries? At the same time, I see on other part of our community dealing with transatlantic relations, this over-optimism about the durability of the transatlantic relation. But still, my question would be about what could go wrong. If you could identify one thing that Russia could do in its foreign policy, in its internal policy, for China to fundamentally reevaluate this relationship, and potentially vice versa? What could China do in its internal policy, external policy for Russia to fundamentally reevaluate this policy? So not the external parts, but the internal relationship. What would change their minds? What could change this trajectory? Thank you very much.
Okay, that seems like a helpfully precise question for everyone to jump back on before I go to Witold Rodkiewicz. Who wants to jump in on that first? Yes, Bogdan.
As I understand, Łukasz Kulesza was directly challenging me. That's a reason I'm asking for the voice, because I was one of those who was declaring that currently the situation is almost good. In the longer term, we have a problem. No, I'm definitely not underestimate both leadership, especially the Chinese one. I'm observing China for half a century, so I know what is possible from them. And in this respect, they are definitely not trusting each other. There's a lot of interests, there's a lot of linkages, there's common platforms right now, but not trust within. If you discuss with them, I don't know, I will not say anything about the Russian elites, but the Chinese, I am in constant contact with them, of course, not during the pandemic, because I'm not ready to go for 3 weeks quarantine, paying myself for this pleasure. So this is the situation which we had previously. And your question is very, very important one. What will be this turning point in this relationship? In my mind, of course, I'm guessing, but according to my knowledge and assessment, if China will start to arrange a Chinese-focused or Chinese-oriented Sino-centric global order, or even regional order. Please take into consideration that, for instance, Laos and Cambodia are already tributary countries towards China. What will happen if Russia will be asked to be tributary towards the Beijing? This is the question, definitely so. For the Russians, it's better for Sasha Gabuyev or the others to explain, but to my mind, if China will be not 5 times stronger economically as it is now, but 10 times stronger, this will be also a necessity to turn towards the West, to Germany, to European Union, to US, because China is growing, is modernizing itself quicker, and in high technology as well. Also, what's going on recently in space. Here, in this respect, Russia needs to be suspicious. And,
great, thank you. Actually, if it's all right, just so we can kind of get a few more questions going back and forth, I'd like to go to the others to come back on that. Sasha, one of the things that's often flagged in this context also is Central Asia. I wonder if anything has been gleaned from what we've been seeing there recently, even the Afghanistan aftermath and various things there. If you might also just kind of briefly comment on that, but if you can also just get back directly to Lukasz's question, and then Yuichi, and then Kadri.
Lukasz, you need to clarify, something will happen that will change the relationship fundamentally in positive or negative sense, or both?
Both.
Okay. So I think that in China, first, I agree with you that I see that the fundamentals for a normal, pragmatic relationship there for many years to come. And the asymmetry that we mentioned, there is no symmetry between Russia and the West. And I think that we coexisted quite okay up until recently. And if Putin would take Biden's offer to stabilize and make the relationship more pragmatic and confrontation more manageable, we could continue to coexist on better terms, if not the obsession with Ukraine. So here I think that Russia is a much weaker power than either the US or China in kind of comprehensive term. It's a weaker player than Europe in economic terms and technology terms, but it's still a great power. And I think that balancing is in the DNA of Russia. So it can handle much stronger opponents quite well up to a point. The reason why Russia is a raw material appendage is a lack of structural reforms that don't happen in Russia for mostly political reasons rather than anything else. So structure of Russia's trade with European Union is same as structure of Russia's trade with China. We found glorious to be European Union's resource appendage. So it's now being normalized to be a resource appendage to China as well. So I don't think that there are too many contradictions. Going forward, however, the asymmetry and assertiveness will provide additional problems and tensions that don't exist now, but that absolutely doesn't mean a U-turn or that Russia will try to kind of burn all the bridges of China and will abruptly rush to be rescued by Europeans. I think that also we sometimes tend to overestimate the importance of Putin and Xi as two authoritarian leaders. If you carefully look, Vladimir Putin has inherited his China policy from no one else than Mikhail Gorbachev, like a pragmatic realization that, hey, it's a giant nuclear-armed neighbor next door. We need to come to terms and we need to be pragmatic. Same policy of Boris Yeltsin, same of Vladimir Putin, definitely amplified by growing contradictions between Russia and the US. Same with Xi Jinping, like he inherited his Russia policy from Deng Xiaoping. So I think that there is a certain consistency. Very positive scenario in Russia would be final structural reforms and more pragmatic relationship, more pragmatic attitude towards foreign policy, no obsession about dominating Ukraine or other countries in Eastern Europe. That would arrive at a more balanced relationship with the West, although I don't think that Russia can be integrated in transatlantic family, doesn't need to be. I don't think that all the contradictions will be gone, but I think that here the foreign policy will be more balanced. But that doesn't mean that ties to China will not be good. An unlikely scenario is a sudden departure of Putin and Putinism and a leader that is Yeltsin at the very beginning of his tenure when he wanted to build up ties with Taiwan because Taiwan is a democracy too. He was later on very quickly convinced that China will be not wiped out from the map. They will not fly to a different planet. So we need to be pragmatic about this, Mr. President. So if tomorrow Alexei Navalny is the president and if he has good advice, I think that we will see a lot of same in terms of Russia-China relationship. On China, and that's my final point, I think that this growing assertiveness, growing desire to kind of work on historic memory, forget about all the positive pages of shared history, like Russia is barely mentioned in the historic resolution of the latest party plenum. Russia frets a lot about Eastern Europeans removing the statues of kind of Soviet liberators. Same happens in China, Russia is quiet, right? So if the public attitude in China becomes increasingly focused on the dark pages, that doesn't mean that we are at war with China, but that makes the relationship much more problematic. And that poses a really grave challenge for the diplomats on how to manage that. That will be a problem for Beijing too, but that's, I think, again, 10, 15 years down the road. I'll stop here.
Yoichi.
Yes, I have a strong impression that in Beijing, domestic politics becomes much more important than before in creating its own foreign policy. It means that China's foreign ministry is much less relevant. And it means that the diplomats, of course, Russian school as well, they have much less influence than before. So if something happens within Chinese domestic politics, it would undoubtedly affect its foreign policy or foreign relations with Russia as well. As well, I think that if something happened within Russian domestic politics, it would change or transform its relationship with China as well. So far, the reality seems to be that the relationship between the two sides, Russia and China, is vulnerable. That's why the both sides, particularly both leaders, President Xi and President Putin, have been extremely careful in managing its good relationship between the two sides. So I don't think that it continues. It would be damaged or destroyed within a decade because it is always difficult to avoid every sort of miscalculation or misunderstanding or mistreatment. If something happens between the two sides based upon their miscalculation or misconduct, it would affect the bilateral relationship between Russia and China. So this would transform, I think, global politics as well.
Kadri.
Thank you. To also address a little bit Margarita's comment on alliance, I don't think that Russia and China are aspiring to a formal alliance. They have had one in Soviet period, and it was short-lived because disappointed both sides. But they are coordinating. That said, I'm not sure they are learning authoritarianism from each other. I think that is more complicated. Sasha has written a paper about it together with Leonid Kovacic, Comrades in Tweets. And actually the finding there is that both are trying to replicate American public diplomacy or Western in ways they can, which is often clumsy. But I'd recommend that. I think it's sort of more complicated than them learning from each other. And as to the nature of a relationship, what could change it, I do think that in the current Western debate, it probably makes sense to stress that it is more resilient than we think, simply because people are inclined to think that, oh, that's bound to collapse. We take it for granted. We think we don't need to do anything. And that is, that's a point of view we shouldn't have. That said, there is lots of distrust of China in the corners of Russian policymaking. It's not public because it's not fashionable in Moscow these days to be publicly distrustful about China. But you talk to people and you start hearing things. For instance, Moscow, the city of Moscow, has invested a lot in face recognition technology. The brain center of that thing is somewhere in southern Moscow, occupies several apartment buildings. Technology in Rose is Russian to the extent possible, alternatively American. China has provided only power banks or something very low tech, because Russia doesn't want China's high-tech technology in sensitive spheres. Or likewise, I was in Moscow in late October, early November, talked with whom I could. In the course of that, I got some internal gossip from one big state company, and it was amazing. They are convinced that virus came from the lab. They don't believe alternative theories. They are also convinced that China is supporting Greta Thunberg because Greta is creating such a good market for solar panels. So lots of sort of conspiracy theories. And so the question is whether these concerns will be addressed in ways that make them go away, or will they magnify and break through into mainstream political thinking in Russia? And it really could go either way. The former fears about Central Asia, who gains upper hand in Central Asia, or potential Chinese takeover of Russia's Far East, these have been addressed in ways that made them diminish. Russia and China are cooperating in Central Asia, and Chinese, partially thanks to COVID, they have themselves abandoned Russia's Far East. So, these are not big issues right now. These other issues that I'm mentioning, they could also go away, or they could magnify. We really do not know.
Great, thanks so much. Now, I think we're kind of getting to the wrap up now. If there is anyone else who wants to jump in with questions or shoot me something in a chat message or anything, if you want it posed to the panelists in their closing comments. But I have Witold Rodkiewicz next.
Well, first, fantastic discussion, and thank you. It's really a privilege to be able to listen to such experts. The first thing is that I have a question to the experts. Reading Russian publications, experts and officials and so on, I had an impression lately that increasingly there is I see Chinese official discourse on world order, on international relations, creeping into that. So increasingly, it seems like there is an acceptance or emulation of Chinese sort of ideology line in Moscow. So that's the question. But also, if I can, I also have a couple of comments. First of all, about our reading of Russia-China relationship, and I come from the more of a Russian side. I don't know much about China, but it seems to me that we have to be more attentive to the peculiarities of the local political culture, which I think has very strong differences from the type of political culture that we are used to, and hence we pay attention to things that are not really important and miss some things that are important in sort of analysis. So let me, for example, look at the nature of the relationship, the issue of trust. We tend to say, okay, there is this trust, so this cannot work. I think especially Russian political culture is built on the assumption that trust is really not possible. So you have to work with people or partners who you basically distrust. This is not something that's the basis of the relationship. I think the basis on the relationship on the Russian side is a kind of conviction that we understand the interest of our partner. And as long as we think that it's the interest of the partner to work with us, in other words, that we have more common interests than contradictory interests, the relationship is going to work. And I think this is the situation now, that they think that there is more common interests than there are interests that divide them. Hence, this is the basis of the relationship. And in that sense, I also think that, and here also is a question, because it's kind of, it seems to me that there is a fundamental, at least within the group that holds power in Russia right now, that a Sinocentric system is a lesser evil from the point of view of their interests than a liberal Americano-centric, US-centric system. And they understand that the fundamental interest of both China and Russian elite is to defend against this system being established and strengthened. And I think this trumps all the differences, especially on the Russian side. And
if it's possible, just to wrap up, like the last 5 seconds.
Yeah, I'll stop here.
Okay, perfect. So we're almost at time. I'd like to give each of the panelists in reverse order from the beginning, just the kind of final moment to respond and give any closing thoughts that you have on the topic. Starting therefore with Yoichi.
Well, nothing particular. I just like to say that I really enjoyed the great discussion to save time.
Super efficient. Bogdan.
Just 3 points and farewell, because unfortunately I cannot join you in the next sessions. Sorry for that. My 3 quick points. Both China and Russia do love power politics. This is in their DNA, and they love that Americans initiated that, which is very good for them, very bad for European Union, because by definition, we are not hard power, but soft or normative power. This is point number one. Point number two, Xi Jinping is different than any other Russian rulers. I know the narrative in China. They are treating very badly both Gorbachev and Yeltsin because they destroyed their empire. And they are treating quite well Mr. Putin because he is resembling them. During the Xi Jinping's era, we have once again one man's rule. He is even described as chairman of everything because he is everywhere and ruling everything. So when he will be ruling for a longer time, his responsibility. But we know, observers know what is his final aim and goal. And this is to say farewell to so-called 100 years of humiliation provided by the Western powers, including Russia, and unfortunately, including Japan. So we have a revisionistic power, and they want to say to themselves that we are strong civilization again, against all the odds. So we have a new chapter in human history, definitely so, because 30 or 40 years ago, China could be neglected. Now everything is surrounding China, and crucial position is definitely that of the US, not even Russians or the others. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Janka, I hope to see you in Warsaw again. Springtime is coming.
Thanks very much, Kadri.
Thank you. Trying to be brief, I think we should keep in mind that Russia and China are still very different countries. For all the authoritarian tendencies we can observe both here and there, I think these have a totally different function in these two countries. In China, I mean, I maybe shouldn't be saying much about China. I don't know the country, but I can imagine that China can think that these things make the country stronger. In Russia's case, to me, it is obvious that excessive authoritarianism that we are seeing lately, closure of lots of NGOs, bans on media, etc., that is making Russia weaker. Russia is not by nature a sort of all-out authoritarian country. It's not a democratic one either. It's a tricky animal. But Russian authoritarianism has always included some free-thinking bubbles, some, I'm tempted to use Russian word, volnodumia, that sort of maverick free-thinking, privileged academics, so forth. So I think authoritarianism that we are observing now is making Russia weaker. So they are, by nature, they are different countries. This doesn't exclude their cooperation. They are not deemed to disagree. They can work together, but also they can split. And I think from the West, it needs a thoughtful policy. I don't think we should take either trend for granted, alliance between Russia and China or them splitting off. We should pay a sober view and think what is in our interest, given the realities and what we can do.
Thanks very much. And the last word to Sasha.
Witold, I totally share your assessment about a lot of Chinese language encroaching in the joint documents. The concept of Greater Eurasia, as was explained to me by one practitioner in Moscow, was developed there to be a placeholder for something that if you have to draft a joint document between Putin and Xi, it will be all of kind of Belt and Road and Community of Common Destiny. So all of the Chinese policy slogans will be there. And we need to have something of our own, which is distinctively Russian. And like this Greater Eurasia part was developed by practitioners to be there. And then it started a life of its own, kind of blown by Sergei Karaganov and many other people. I share your major assessment too, that it's an interest-driven relationship, first and foremost. Complete trust is absent, but whereas complete trust in our world, definitely not between the great powers, not even between all the NATO allies, as we know. And I think that as long as countries remain pragmatic and well-equipped with some expertise to understand each other and to guard their interests, I think that's a solid foundation for a kind of healthy, normal, pragmatic relationship, which has definitely a lot of thorny issues and increasing amount of thorny issues, but overall functions well. For the West, I can totally subscribe to Kadri's call for a much more nuanced approach. There is this naivety in kind of initial Macron's call, like, let's tear them apart. Russia belongs to Western family, which it totally doesn't. But at the same time, there used to be this very dismissive kind of attitude. There is no there, so we shouldn't be worried. And I think that as this conversation flows, it must become much more pragmatic and kind of nuanced. For example, when we talk about the sanctions against Russia, if it invades Ukraine again, and like semiconductors and all other tech equipment is mentioned, let's be granular and see at some side effects, because yes, like Kadri mentioned, the surveillance systems where the Chinese provided power banks and cameras, and Russia had access to Cisco technology to build the core of this. But what about it's denied, and then Russia has to rely on China, because it's not that Russia will stop development of modern tech, and it's not that it will stop procuring it from somewhere else, and the somewhere else is China's only. So how granular does European Union want to be in order not to strengthen this already existing links? I think that's a good pragmatic topic for Western policymakers to debate. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Sasha. And my thanks to all the speakers, to ECFR, to the Japanese embassy in Warsaw in particular as well. Sorry so much time was taken up with my questions. I had lots more on Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, a whole series of other things, but I'm glad we were able to get through so much. Thanks to everyone for joining. I'm going to hand over to Janka now for final comments and wrap up.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you to you for brilliant moderating of this session. Thank you to all of our fantastic speakers. I'm very glad that we were able to bring this together, and I do think that we will arrange separate conversations for you to raise all of your questions to the speakers individually in other sessions as well that we can make possible. Thank you to everyone who's joined us on Facebook or on YouTube on the live stream. And it is for me to tell you that we will rejoin each other, re-adjourn at 11 o'clock. Please make sure to click on the other Zoom link that you have been provided with by Zoom directly to log into that session. I look forward to deepening our conversation for the next 2 hours. And to all of those on Facebook and YouTube, I wish you a wonderful day wherever you are. I hope it's as sunny as Berlin, which is rare for January. And so hopefully that is a good sign for the conversation ahead. Thank you very much also to Ambassador Miyajima, and we will see some of you shortly and hopefully a lot of you later on. Thank you very much.